Joining us now is Steve Quayle. Thank you, Steve.
Wow, David, good. It's really nice to be on with you because Jade Helm, I think, needs to be put in the larger context. This is the first time in history that a 2-month-long operation is going to be focusing on the American public. We know that the same tactics that are being proposed for the exercise to take place between the hours of midnight and 4 or 5 in the morning is exactly what the special operations troops did prior to the bombing of Iraq and all of our different Middle Eastern ventures, whether it's Afghanistan. In other words, you move the special operations community in prior to an event. Now, remember, I want to take everybody back to Larry Greatwall in his book, No Place to Hide. If people remember, he was the one that penetrated the weather underground when Bill Ayers and 24 other elite from Ivy League trained schools were talking about the necessity in the early 70s of killing 25 million Americans, and prior to the killing of them, moving them into detention camps for re-education. Now, I know, David, that you've read his stuff, but here's the larger context. I think that people are being tied up with the events or the implementation of how they're going to round up people and kill them, and they're forgetting the idea that when Bill Ayers was making this comment, he was deadly serious. Now, I've just taken the population density at that point in history, moved it into our point in history, and the numbers I've heard from special operations, active duty generals in the past, contemporary military and intelligence agents, is they're up to 80 million to 100 million people. So I think if people put it into context, notice a change. Notice a change when Middle East terrorists became obviously embraced by this administration. Now, that's the context. I think that people have got to understand that context, David, because what we're talking about is not an exercise. When the local police are told to stand down and not respond to gunfire, by the way, it's a live fire exercise. When we've seen massive YouTube videos, you guys at Infowars.com have led the charge in showing all the videos coming into you from all over the country. People are now starting to get it. And the point that I want to really get across to everyone today, and thank you for taking this hour out of your time to interview me, is this. This is the full-scale implementation of the red, the blue, and the green list. The red list are people. Now, do you remember, David, and I'll let you obviously respond because that's just my intro, the days years ago when gun owners' homes are being GPSed?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we warned about that. And we tried to get people to understand. I was literally in my front yard in right at a mountain community at the base of the mountains in Bozeman, Montana, when the guy came up with his GPS unit and his bicycle and came literally to my front door. And I watched. The reason I didn't challenge him at the time, I wanted to see. To the left of me were leftists, to the right of me were leftists, and I wanted to see if they even got GPS. Absolutely not, okay? So I watched. This is not a report. Well, we heard massive reports of that happening. And the deal that people have got to understand is this, that with the implementation of the red list, the blue list, and green list, that was given to me almost 20 years ago, actually before that, about how it would be implemented when they were ready to make their move by the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency, who was murdered for the Western United States. So that wasn't just, quote, internet talk, and obviously that at that point the internet was just in its beginnings. But I think it's important that people have got to understand that this explains everything. It explains the Chinese, it explains the Russians, it explains the North Koreans, and it explains the assault coming on the United States from Mexico. Remember when we broke the story? I think Alex had me on to talk about the Chinese troops. You guys verified it below the border.
Yes.
And then the thing that people have got to understand is that this is the plan. So when I say don't lose track of it in perspective, I want to just make one sentence and I'll give it back to you. In No Place to Hide, I call him Great Wall, maybe it's Grathwall, explains that the weather men actually believed that they would be successful in overthrowing U.S. government, and that with the help of the Cubans, Chinese, Russians, and North Vietnamese, they would occupy America. Now, remember, this is during the Vietnam War. Americans would have to be re-educated in camps, similar to what communists did in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and other countries that they had taken over. And then here's one of the most chilling revelations. I asked, well, Great Wall speaking, well, what is going to happen to those people we can't re-educate that are diehard capitalists? And the reply is they'd have to be eliminated. So, David, that's the context of what we see. The American people, as Alex has pointed out, as you've pointed out, as the, going on day after day, hours after hours, have become the enemy. And now in the face of basically nuclear tension, and for the record, I used to write about nuclear weapons and their effects and during the Cold War years, and civil defense and all that stuff. So as I look back on the perspective, we have seen the absolute taking apart of our military. Our top flag officers and generals fired, any battlefield experience, and we've seen complete redirection of funds from foreign enemies to the internal enemies. And I've read on the air the letter that was sent in those days by, I believe it was either Janet Reno or Napolitano to the Russians requesting their help and the foreign troops. So you can't deny it any longer. People used to poo-poo black helicopters. They used to poo-poo Russian troops, Chinese troops.
Well, of course, exactly. We've had the article we put up over the weekend that Paul Joseph Watson and Alex Jones put together, listing all the many times that they have defined who their domestic enemies are. It's not just what Larry Grathwohl was saying. We've been seeing this coming from the administration. We've been seeing it coming out of the military academies and other think tanks that are associated with the military. We saw it coming out of the MIAC report. You're talking about the red list, the blue list, and the green list. Break that down for the audience.
The red list are the primary target for the New World Order in the United States of America when the order is given. The lists already exist, and again, according to, and I want to make this clear, I cannot know this stuff unless people tell me. Just like Alex gets tips, you get tips, David. There are people out there that genuinely love their country. So that's how I got this. The red list are primarily firearms owners. They are constitutionalists. They are people who have been politically active in resisting the New World Order. And those are the people that are their targets. And let me make this clear. They're not coming to take the guns away. They're coming to terminate, exterminate, blow away the gun owners. Again, special operations teams are not sent in to take prisoners unless it's a high-value target for a later date. They basically are trained to go in and just obliterate, okay? Now, again, when I get told this by a four-star general, active duty, and by the way, you guys have more probably active duty spec ops and spooks in Austin than any other city in the United States of America. You probably know that. If you don't, I will tell you that. And the thing that's fascinating to me, David, is the red list basically goes down the first 30 days, okay? So let's say they've increased it to 60 days. Well, they're combining now two different events. Now, the system that's been set to communicate with law enforcement from the Department of Homeland Security is a pretty secure system now. They can lock out individual officers from being able to hear the general alerts. They can punish or they can terminate. Now, these are really hard statements for people to understand. Quick anecdote, 30-second version. Chief of detectives in a major metropolitan city heard me on, I think it was one of the interviews Alex and I were doing a couple years ago. He didn't think I was basically upfront with the information until a foreign observer was assigned. I told him what to look for. The foreign observer knew everything about his family, his children, when they went to school, how much money he made. He knew everything, and he rode along in the back of two detectives' cars. And the interesting thing is I got a call from the individual probably a week later, and he said, you're right, this is going down just exactly as you said. Well, I wasn't the originator of that. The blue list are law enforcement, National Guard, and anybody who's contributing to the execution and the takedown of the red list. 30 days to 60 days after that, those guys get wasted. Now, I don't know what word you would use, David, but they're murdered. They're killed.
Yeah.
Now, where have we seen that in history before? Go ahead. On the West Coast, and I don't know it or I'd tell it. Here's the issue. The issue is, David, that the American people must understand that the sheer placement of the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, troops on the streets, and everything else is indicative. Now, let's talk about Jade Helm, the name. May I do that? The
sure.
Blues simply are the people that they go into re-education and are assimilated. They get to live, but they get to live as perpetual drones or techno-serfs at the behest of the New World Order. The thing that is really critical for people to understand is that Jade Helm's name, Jade is always associated with China. It has nothing to do primarily with the Middle East. It has everything to do with the Far East. If I tell you the captain's at the helm, that means he's steering the ship. That means that he is the one who's in charge of the direction. One of the Chinese demands upon the United States government was the fact that they needed to disarm the American public. You remember that story when it came out that China absolutely demanded that the American public be disarmed?
Yeah, I remember that was kind of strange, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And there's always something behind that. It's kind of like when the UN came out and said, you need to shut down Colorado and Washington State. The federal government needs to shut that down because we have a UN drug treaty. And, of course, it was the UN that set up the schedule for the war on drugs 10 years before Nixon declared the war on drugs.
Right. Doesn't matter if it's Britain. It doesn't matter who it is. Everyone's going to China because basically it's a truism, a maxism in the world that he who has the gold makes the rules. One of the things the bankers have been able to do is to transfer the gold that was in the United States. It's irrelevant if there's anything in Fort Knox. I'm here to tell you that there's nothing there. The point being is that China, with its 30,000 plus tons of gold, by the way, the World Gold Council is totally inaccurate in the country's gold holdings, just they're wrong. Russia, for instance, has right now in excess of 10 to 15,000 tons of gold. So the point is, let me make this clear. Jade Helm may be the orchestration and the introduction of the Chinese yuan or renminbi in a gold-backed or commodity-backed form. At that point, the dollar will lose value almost overnight, if not become worthless. My guess is, just quick and dirty, it goes down 50% in a matter of days and then another 30%. Well, that's not going to make anybody happy in the United States. The point being is that the riots will be generated. Now, here's something people need to do. Go to the root of the problem. You understand the fruit and how it will be implemented. In order for the communist revolution to take place, they want to engender civil war. I've been saying that. Alex has been saying that. And by the way, obviously with the Mayak report and others, when the veterans were vilified, any man or woman who has served in this country in any official capacity had to note that this man's military, and I've never been in the military, but that's what a lot of them call it, has changed so dramatically. And it's fascinating to me that even yesterday or the day before, I may be off a day, but the President of the United States has now declared they want to cut back the military pensions. At the same time, there's unlimited amounts of money to purchase billions of rounds of ammo, MRAPs, the police department who have been militarized. So here's what I'm saying.
When you're talking about that, Steve, I think it's very interesting that it was just last summer that the Pentagon announced that they were going to stop giving equipment to fire departments. This was something that they have been doing since right after World War II, giving equipment to small rural fire departments because they can't afford very much, and they're the ones who have to deal with the really large fires. And so they shut that down. It stayed shut down for about a month, but there was a lot of pressure from the firemen, from congressmen and senators. They got that restarted. But that was happening at the very same time they couldn't get enough equipment quickly enough into all these small towns for law enforcement. They only wanted to give equipment to people who had the power and the authority to arrest. That was going to be what they were going to do it for, not to the fire departments. They wanted to completely shut that down.
Well, and you're correct. So the point is that, in essence, all the fire departments, any authority figures that with the power to arrest, and by the way, everybody, as you know, has been given the power to arrest now, from IRS agents to remember when the Forest Service Rangers never wore weapons. I can tell you from watching them, I take a lot of photographs, and in the national parks, and now you would swear that you would declare freely. You can't believe how weighted down those guys are with weapons in their car, AR-15s and shotguns.
And of course, you shouldn't worry about the fact that they got billions of rounds of hollow point bullets, which the military doesn't even use. You shouldn't even worry about that. As we got all the pushback, they would look at the small purchases for some of these organizations and say, well, that's just for target shooting. But it's $3 billion. They would take the very smallest ones and they would push back against that. But we won that fight.